In his book, House Drew envisions in his book, House Drew envisions himself becoming a dictator enforcing on the people his radical views. Page 148. They recognized the fact that Drew dominated the situation and that a mastermind had at least risen in the Republic. He now assumes the title of general. General Drew announced his purpose of assuming the powers of a dictator. They were assured that he was free from any personal ambition. He proclaimed himself administrator of the Republic. This pensive dreamer who imagined himself a dictator actually managed to place himself in the position of the confidential advisor to the president. What, stink bug? Want me to open up the door for you? There you go. Yeah, you feel my punk punk. This pensive dreamer who imagined himself a dictator actually managed to place himself in the position of the confidential advisor to the President of the United States, and then to have many of his desires enacted into law. On page 227, he lists some of the laws he wishes to enact as dictator. Among them are an old age pension law, laborers' insurance compensation, cooperative markets, a Federal Reserve banking system, cooperative loans, national employment bureaus, and other social legislation, some of which was enacted during Wilson's administration, and others during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. The latter was actually a continuation of the Wilson administration. Where's the ball? What is it? Where's the ball, Papa? Get the ball. Go get it. Go get it, Papa. Go get it. Go get the ball. Go get the ball, Papa. Where's the ball? Come on, get the ball. Come on. Get your ball. Yeah. Get it. Yeah, do it. Get it. Good job. Come on. Yeah. Yeah. Come on. on the boat. Yeah, Papa. We know. We know. No. I'll give you that. Mr. Aldrich, on page 227, he lists some of the laws he wishes to enact as dictator. Among them are an old age pension law. The latter was actually a continuation of the Wilson administration, with many of the same personnel, and with House guiding the administration from behind the scenes. Like most of the behind-the-scenes operators in this book, Colonel Edward Mendel House had the obligatory London connection. Originally a Dutch family, Huyss, his ancestors had lived in England for 300 years, after which his father settled in Texas, where he made a fortune in blockade running during the Civil War, shipping cotton and other contraband to his British connections, including the Rothschilds, and bringing back supplies for the beleaguered Texans. The senior House, not trusting the volatile Texas situation, prudently deposited all of his profits from his blockade running in gold with Baring banking house in London. At the close of the Civil War, he was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He named his son, Mendel, after one of his merchant associates. According to Arthur Howden Smith, when House's father died in 1880, his estate was distributed among his sons as follows. Thomas William got the banking business, John the sugar plantation, and Edward M. the cotton plantations, which brought him an income of $20,000 a year. At the age of 12, the young Edward Mendel House had brain fever and was later further crippled by sunstroke. He was a semi-invalid, and his ailments gave him an odd Oriental appearance. He never entered any profession, but used his father's money to become the kingmaker of Texas politics, successively electing 5 governors from 1893 to 1911. In 1911, he began to support Wilson for president, and through the crucial Texas delegation to him, which ensured his nomination. House met Wilson for the first time at the Hotel Gotham, May 31, 1912. In The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, by George Sylvester Vyrick, Vyrick writes, "What, I, House, cemented your friendship?" "What," I asked House, "cemented your friendship?" "The identity of our temperaments and our public policies," answered House. What was your purpose and his? To translate into legislation certain liberal and progressive ideas. To translate into legislation certain liberal and progressive ideas. House told Byrek that when he went to Wilson at the White House, he handed him $35,000. This was exceeded only by the $50,000 which Bernard Baruch had given Wilson. The successful enactment of House's programs did not escape the notice of other Wilson associates. In Volume 1, page 157 of the Intimate Papers of Colonel House notes, cabinet members like Mr. Lane and Mr. Bryan commented upon the influence of Drew with the President. All that the book has said should be, wrote Lane, comes about. The President comes to Philip Drew in the end. House recorded some of his efforts on behalf of the Federal Reserve Act in the Intimate Papers of Colonel House. December 19, 1912. I talked with Paul Warburg over the phone concerning currency reform. I told of my trip to Washington and what I had done there to get it in working order. I told him that the Senate and the congressmen seemed anxious to do what he desired, and that President-elect Wilson thought straight concerning the issue. Thus we have Warburg's agent in Washington, Colonel House, assuring him that the Senate and congressmen will do what he desires, and that the President-elect thought straight concerning the issue. In this context, representative government seems to have ceased to exist. House continues in his papers, March 13, 1913. Warburg and I had an intimate discussion concerning currency reform. March 27, 1913. Mr. J.P. Morgan, Jr. and Mr. Denny of his firm came promptly at 5. McAdoo came about 10 minutes afterwards. Morgan had a currency plan already printed. I suggested he have it typewritten, so it would not seem too prearranged, and send it to Wilson and myself today. July 23, 1913. I tried to show Mayor Quincy, of Boston, the folly of the Eastern bankers taking an antagonistic attitude towards the currency bill. I explained to Major Henry Higginson with what care the bill had been framed. Just before he arrived, I had finished a review by Professor Sprague of Harvard of Paul Warburg's criticism of the Glass-Owens bill, and will transmit it to Washington tomorrow. Every banker known to Warburg, who knows the subject practically, has been called up about the making of the bill. October 13, 1913. Paul Warburg was my first caller today. He came to discuss the currency measure. There are many features of the Owen Glass bill that he does not approve. I promised to him to put him in touch with McAdoo and Senator Owen so that he might discuss it with them. November 17, 1913. Paul Warburger telephoned about his trip to Washington. Later, he and Mr. Jacob Schiff came over for a few minutes. Warburg did most of the talking. He had a new suggestion in regard to grouping the regular Reserve Bank so as to get the units welded together and in easier touch with the Federal Reserve Board. George Sylvester Byrek, in The Strangest Friendship in History. Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House wrote, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, the Morgans put their faith in House. When the Federal Reserve legislation at last assumed definitive shape, House was the intermediary between the White House and the financiers. On page 45, Byrek notes, Colonel House looks upon the reform of the monetary system as the crowning internal achievement of the Wilson administration. The Glass Bill, the House version of the final Federal Reserve Act, had passed the House on September 18, 1913, by 287 to 85. On December 19, 1913, the Senate passed their version by a vote of 54 to 34. More than 40 important differences in the House and Senate versions remained to be settled, and the opponents of the bill in both houses of Congress were led to believe that many weeks would yet elapse before the conference bill would be ready for consideration. The congressmen prepared to leave Washington for the annual Christmas recess, assured that the conference bill would not be brought up until the following year. Now the money creators prepared and executed the most brilliant stroke of their plan. In a single day, they ironed out all 40 of the disputed passages in the bill and quickly brought it to a vote. On Monday, December 22, 1913, the bill was passed by the House 282 to 60, and the Senate 43 to 23. On December 21, 1913, the New York Times commented editorially on the act. New York will be on a firmer basis of financial growth, and we shall soon see her the money center of the world. The New York Times reported on the front page, Monday, December 22nd, 1913, in headlines, "Money bill may be law today. Conferences had adjusted nearly all differences at 1:30 this morning. No deposits guarantees. Senate yields on this point, but puts through many other changes." With almost unprecedented speed, the conference to adjust the House and Senate differences on the currency bill practically completed its labors early this morning. On Saturday, the conferees did little more than dispose of the preliminaries, leaving 40 essential differences to be thrashed out Sunday. No other legislation of importance will be taken up in either House or Congress. Will be taken up in either House of Congress this week. Members of both houses are already preparing to leave Washington. Unprecedented speed, says the New York Times. One sees the fine hand of Paul Warburg in this final strategy. Some of the bill's most vocal critics had already left Washington. It was a long-standing political courtesy that important legislation would not be acted upon during the week before Christmas, but this tradition was rudely shattered in order to perpetuate the Federal Reserve Act on the American people. The Times buried a brief quote from the Congressman Lindbergh that the bill would establish the most gigantic trust on earth, and quoted Representative Guernsey of Maine, a Republican on the House Banking and Currency Committee, that this is inflation bill. The only question being the extent of the inflation. Congressman Lindbergh said on that historic day to the House, This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The trusts will soon realize that they have gone too far, even for their own good. The people must make a declaration of independence to relieve themselves from the monetary power. This they will be able to do by taking control of Congress. Wall Streeters could not cheat us if you senators and representatives did not make a humbug of Congress. If we had a people's Congress, there would be stability. The greatest crimes of Congress is its currency system. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetuated by this banking bill. The caucus and the party bosses have again operated and prevented the people from getting the benefit of their own government. The December 23, 1913 New York Times editorially commented in contrast to Congressman Lindbergh's criticism of the bill. What a surprise. The banking and currency bill became better and sounder every time it was sent from one end of the Capitol to the other. Congress worked under public supervision in making the bill. This is also what pisses me off. There's no public supervision of anything that government does. By public supervision, exactly, the Times apparently meant Paul Warburg, exactly, who for several days he had maintained a small office in the Capitol building, where he directed the successful pre-Christmas campaign to pass the bill, and where senators and congressmen came hourly at his bidding to carry out his strategy. This I know because I was looking into, Twitch. I've been researching a lot about Texas Workforce Commission, and I saw their sunshine laws, and they were having a meeting, to discuss just the system, the whole TWIC agency, and it said in there that the public that was there for the hearing or presentation or whatever was represented by one person who worked for the agency. And I was just like, what? This isn't public supervision. This isn't the public. This is a person who works for the agency standing in for the public. That's also why when I saw that Biden thing saying, we are the government, as in them, we are the people, as in the government are the people. They don't consider us people, they consider us slaves. They are the people, quote unquote. Anyway, sorry. By public supervision, the Times apparently meant Paul Warburg. The unprecedented speed with which the Federal Reserve Act had been passed by Congress during what became known as the Christmas Massacre had one unforeseen aspect. Woodrow Wilson was taken unaware, as he, like many others, had been assured the bill would not come up for a vote until after Christmas. Now he refused to sign it, because he objected to the provisions for the selection of Class B directors. William L. White relates in his biography of Bernard Baruch that Baruch a principal contributor to Wilson's campaign fund, was stunned when he was informed that Wilson refused to sign the bill. He hurried to the White House and assured Wilson that this was a minor matter, which could be fixed up later through administrative process. Audit the administration, guys! The important thing was to get the Federal Reserve Act signed into law at once. With this reassurance, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913. History proved that on that day, the Constitution ceased to be the governing covenant of the American people, and our liberties were handed over to a small group of international bankers. The December 24, 1913 New York Times carried a front-page headline, "Wilson signs the currency bill." Below it, also in capital letters, were two further headlines, "Prosperity to be free," and "Will help every class." Who could object to any law which provided benefits to everyone? The Times described the festive atmosphere while Wilson's family and government officials watched him sign the bill. "The Christmas spirit pervaded the gathering," exulted the Times. In his biography of Carter Glass, Eustace Smith states that those present at the signing of the bill included Vice President Marshall, Secretary Bryan, Carter Glass, Senator Owen, Secretary McAdoo, Speaker Champ Clark, and other Treasury officials. None of the real writers of the bill, the draftees of Jekyll Island, were present. They had prudently abstained themselves from the scene of their victory. Eustace Smith also wrote, "It was as though Christmas had come 2 days early." On December 24, 1913, Jacob Schiff wrote to Colonel House, "My dear Colonel House, I want to say a word to you for the silent but no doubt effective work you have done in the interest of currency legislation, and to congratulate you that the measure has finally been enacted into law. I am, with good wishes, faithfully yours, Jacob Schiff." Representative Moore of Kansas, in commenting on the passage of the act, said to the House of Representatives, "The President of the United States now becomes the absolute dictator of all the finances of the country. He appoints a controlling board of 7 men, all of whom belong to his political party, even though it is a minority. The Secretary of the Treasury is to rule supreme whenever there is a difference of opinion between himself and the Federal Reserve Board, and only one member of the board is to pass out of office while the President is in office." The 10-year terms of office of members of the board were lengthened by the Banking Act of 1935 to 14 years, which meant that these directors of the nation's finances, although not elected by the people, held office longer than the 3 presidents. While Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, and Paul Warburg basked in the glow of a job well done, the other actors in this drama were subject to later afterthoughts. Woodrow Wilson wrote in 1916, "National Economy and the Banking System," Senate Document Number 3, Number 223, 76 Congress, First Session, in 1939. "Our system of credit is concentrated in the Federal Reserve System. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." When he was asked by Clarence W. Barron whether he approved of the bill as it was finally passed, Warburg remarked, "Well, it hasn't got quite everything we want, but the lack can be adjusted later by administrative process." Woodrow Wilson and Carter Glass are given credit for the act by most contemporary historians, but of all those concerned, Wilson had least to do with congressional action on the bill. George Creel, a veteran Washington correspondent, wrote in Harper's Weekly, June 26, 1915, As far as the Democratic Party was concerned, Woodrow Wilson was without influence, save for the patronage he possessed. It was Bryan who whipped Congress into line on the tariff bill, on the Panama Canal tolls repeal, and on the currency bill. Mr. Bryan later wrote, "That is the one thing in my public career that I regret, my work to secure the enactment of the Federal Reserve Law." On December 25, 1913, the Nation pointed out that the New York stock market began to rise steadily upon news that the Senate was ready to pass the Federal Reserve Act. This belies the claim that the Federal Reserve Act is a monetary reform bill. The New York Stock Exchange is generally considered an accurate barometer of the true meaning of any financial legislation passed in Washington. Senator Aldrich also decided that he no longer had misgivings about the Federal Reserve Act. In a magazine which he owned, and which he called The Independent, he wrote in July 1914, "Before the passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire country." H. W. Locke denounced the Federal Reserve Act in the Great Conspiracy of the House of Morgan. In the Federal Reserve Law, they have wrested from the people and secured for themselves the constitutional power to issue money and regulate the value thereof. On page 31, he writes, The House of Morgan is now in supreme control of our industry, commerce, and political affairs. They are in complete control of the policymaking of the Democratic, Republican, and Progressive parties. The present extraordinary propaganda for preparedness is planned more from home coercion than for defense against foreign aggression. The signing of the Federal Reserve Act by Woodrow Wilson represented the culmination of years of collusion with his intimate friends, Colonel House and Paul Warburg. One of the men with whom House became acquainted in the Wilson administration was Franklin D. Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. As soon as he obtained the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a pilgrimage to Colonel House's home at Magnolia, Massachusetts. Roosevelt, after the Republican hiatus of the 1920s, filled in the goals of Philip Drew, administrator, which Wilson had not been able to carry out. The late Roosevelt's achievements included the enactment of the Social Security program, excess profits tax, Roosevelt, after the Republican hiatus of the 1920s, filled in the goals of Philip Drew, administrator, which Wilson had not been able to carry out. The late Roosevelt's achievements included the enactment of the Social Security program, excess profits tax, and the expansion of the graduated income tax to 90% of earned income. Guys! House's biographer, Charles Seymour, wrote, he was wearied by the details of party politics and appointments. Even the share he had taken in constructive domestic legislation, the Federal Reserve Act, tariff revision, and the income tax amendment, did not satisfy him. From the beginning of 1914, he gave more and more of his time to what he regarded as the highest form of politics, and that for which he particularly suited, international affairs. And for that which he was particularly suited, international affairs. In 1938, shortly before he died, House told Charles Seymour, "During the last 15 years I have been close to the center of things, although few people suspect it. No important foreigner has come to the United States without talking to me. I was close to the movement that nominated Roosevelt. He has given me a free hand in advising him. All the ambassadors have reported to me frequently." A comparative print of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, as passed by the House of Representatives and amended by the Senate, shows the following striking change. The Senate struck out, "to suspend the officials of Federal Reserve banks for cause, stated in writing, with opportunity of hearing, required the removal of said official for incompetency, dereliction of duty, fraud, or deceit. Such removal to be subject to approval by the President of the United States." This was changed by the Senate to read, "to suspend or remove any officer or director of any Federal Reserve Bank, the cause of such removal to be forthwith communicated in writing by the Federal Reserve Board to the removed officer or director and to the said bank." This completely altered the conditions under which an officer or director might be removed. We no longer know what the conditions for removal are, or the cause. Apparently, incompetency, dereliction of duty, fraud, or deceit do not matter to the Federal Reserve Board, or to any agency in the government, in my opinion. Also, the removed officer does not have the opportunity of appeal to the President. In an answer to written inquiry, the Assistant Secretary of the Federal Reserve Board replied that only one officer has been removed for cause in the 36 years, the name and details of this matter being a private concern between the individual, the Reserve Bank concerned, and the Federal Reserve Board. Kind of reminds me of that Dutch banker dude who was talking about all that crazy shit. Masonic. Don't say anything or else we'll kill you. The Federal Reserve System began its operation in 1914 with the activity of the Organization Committee, appointed by Woodrow Wilson and composed of Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, who was his son-in-law, Secretary of Agriculture, Houston, and Comptroller of the Currency, John Skelton Williams. On January 6, 1914, J.P. Morgan met with the Organization Committee in New York. He informed them that there should not be more than 7 regional districts in the new system. This committee was to select the locations of the decentralized reserve banks. They were empowered to select from 8 to 12 reserve banks, although J.P. Morgan had testified he thought that not more than 4 should be selected. Much politicking went into the selection of these sites. as the 12 cities thus favored would become enormously important as centers of finance. New York, of course, was a foregone conclusion. Richmond was the next selection as a payoff to Carter Glass and Woodrow Wilson, the two Virginians who had been given political credit for the Federal Reserve Act. The other selections of the committee were Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Dallas, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and San Francisco. All of these cities later developed important financial districts as a result of this selection. And all those financial districts were the same ones where bricks were ubiquitously laid all over the town and the neighborhoods and all that got completely destroyed were Federal Reserve financial districts. Check it out. These local battles, however, paled in view of the complete dominance of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the system. Ferdinand Lundberg pointed out in America's 60 Families that in practice, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York became the fountainhead of the system of 12 regional banks, for New York was the money market of the nation. The other 11 banks were so many expensive mausoleums erected to solve the local pride and quell the Jacksonian fears of the hinterland. Benjamin Strong, president of the Bankers' Trust, J.P. Morgan, was selected as the first governor of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Adept in high finance, Strong for many years manipulated the country's monetary system at the discretion of directors representing the leading New York banks. Under Strong, the reserve system was brought into interlocking relations with the Bank of England and the Bank of France. Benjamin Strong held his position as governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York until his sudden death in 1928, during a congressional investigation of a secret meetings between reserve governors and heads of European central banks, which brought on the Great Depression of 1929 to 1931. Strong had married the daughter of the president of Bankers' Trust, which brought him into the line of succession in the dynastic intrigues which play such an important role in the world of high finance. He also had been a member of the original Jekyll Island Group, the First Name Club, and was thus qualified for the highest position in the Federal Reserve System, as the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which dominated the entire system. Paul Warburg also is mentioned in J. Lawrence Laughlin's definitive volume, The Federal Reserve Act, Its Origins and Purposes. Mr. Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company offered in March 1910 a fairly well thought-out plan to be known as the United Reserve Bank of the United States. This was published in New York Times of March 24, 1910. The group interested in the purposes of the National Monetary Commission met secretly at Jekyll Island for about 2 weeks in December 1910 and concentrated on the preparation of a bill to be presented to Congress by the National Monetary Commission. The men who were present at Jekyll Island were Senator Aldrich, H.P. Davidson of J.P. Morgan Company, Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company, Frank Vanderlip of the National City Bank, and Charles D. Norton of First National Bank. No doubt the ablest banking mind in the group was that of Mr. Warburg, who had had a European banking training. Senator Aldrich had no special training in banking. A mention of Paul Warburg, written by Harold Kellogg, and titled Warburg the Revolutionist, appeared in the Century magazine, May 1915. Kellogg writes, "He imposed his ideas on a nation of 100 million people. Without Mr. Warburg, there would have been no Federal Reserve Act. The banking house of Warburg and Hamburg has always been strictly a family business. None but a Warburg has been eligible for it, but all Warburgs have been born into it." In 1895, he married the daughter of the late Solomon Loeb of Kuhn Loeb Company. He became a member of Kuhn Loeb Company in 1902. Mr. Warburg's salary from his private businesses has been approximately $500,000 a year in 1902. Mr. Warburg's motives had been purely those of patriotic self-sacrifice. The true purpose of the Federal Reserve Act soon began to disillusion many who had at first believed in its claims. W. H. Allen wrote in Moody's Magazine, 1916, "The purpose of the Federal Reserve Act was to prevent concentration of money in the New York banks by making it profitable for country bankers to use their funds at home. But the movement of currency shows that the New York banks gained from their interior in every month except December 1915, since the act went into effect. The stabilization of rates has taken place in New York alone. In other parts, high rates continue. The act, which was to deprive Wall Street of its funds for speculation, has really given the bulls and the bears such a supply as they had never had before. The truth is that from having clogged the channel to Wall Street, as Mr. Glass so confidently boasted, it actually widened the old channels and opened up two new ones. The first of these leads directly to Washington and gives Wall Street a string on all the surplus cash in the United States Treasury. Besides, in the power to issue banknote currency, it furnishes an inexhaustible supply of credit money. The second channel leads to the great Central Bank of Europe, whereby, through the sale of acceptances, virtually guaranteed by the United States government, Wall Street is granted immunity from foreign demands for gold, which have precipitated every great crisis in our history. For many years, there have been considerable mysteries about who actually owns the stock of the Federal Reserve banks. Congressman Wright Patman, leading critic of the system, tried to find out who the stockholders were. The stock in the original 12 regional Federal Reserve banks was purchased by national banks in those 12 regions. Because the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was to set the interest rates and direct open market operations, thus controlling the daily supply and price of money throughout the United States, it is the stockholders of that bank who are the real directors of the entire system. For the first time, it can be revealed who those stockholders are. This writer has the original organization certificates of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, giving the ownership of shares by the national banks in each district. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York issued 200 The Federal Reserve Bank of New York issued 2003, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York issued 203,053 shares, and, as filed with the Comptroller of the Currency, May 19, 1914, the large New York City banks took more than half of the outstanding shares. The Rockefeller-Kuhn-Loeb controlled National City Bank took the largest number of shares of any bank, 30,000 shares. J.P. Morgan's First National Bank took 15,000 shares. When these two banks merged in 1955, they owned in one block almost one-fourth of the shares in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which controlled the entire system. And thus they could name Paul Volcker or anyone else they chose to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Chase National Bank took 6,000 shares. The Marine Nation Bank of Buffalo, later known as Marine Midland, took 6,000 shares. This bank was owned by the Sholkoff family, which controlled Niagara Power Company and other large interests. The Sholkoff family, which controlled Niagara Power Company and other large interests. National Bank of Commerce of New York City took 21,000 shares. The shareholders of these banks, which own the stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, are the people who have controlled our political and economic destinies since 1914. They are the Rothschilds of Europe, Lazard Freres, Eugene Meyer, Kuhn-Loeb Company, Warburg Company, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, the Rockefeller family, and the J.P. Morgan interests. These interests have merged and consolidated in recent years so that the control is much more concentrated. National Bank of Commerce is now Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. Lehman Brothers has merged with Kuhn-Loeb Company. First National Bank has merged with the National City Bank. And in the other 11 Federal Reserve districts, these same shareholders indirectly own or control shares in those banks, with the other shares owned by the leading families in those areas who own or control the principal industries in these regions. Guys, they own every single thing. What? From you. They stole from you so that they could own everything. The local families set up regional councils on orders from New York of such groups as the Council on Foreign Relations. The local families set up regional councils on orders from New York of such groups as the Council on Foreign Relations, local families, Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and other instruments of control devised by their masters. They finance and control political developments in their area, name candidates, and are seldom successfully opposed in their plans. With the setting up of the 12 financial districts to the Federal Reserve banks, the traditional division of the United States into the 48 states was overthrown, and we entered the era of regionalism, or 12 regions which had no relation to the traditional state boundaries. These developments followed the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, proved every one of the allegations Thomas Jefferson had made against the central bank in 1791. that the subscribers to the Federal Reserve Bank stock had formed a corporation whose stock could be and was held by aliens, that this stock would be transmitted to a certain line of successors, that it would be placed beyond forfeiture and escheat, is cheap, that they would receive a monopoly of banking, which was against the laws of monopoly. They would receive a monopoly of banking, y'all, which would, and that they now had the power to make laws, paramount to the laws of the state. No state legislator can countermand any of the laws laid down by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors for the benefit of their private stockholders. This board issues laws as to what the interest rate shall be, what the quantity of money shall be, and what the price of money shall be. All of these powers abrogate the powers of the state legislators and the responsibility to the citizens of those states. The New York Times stated that the Federal Reserve Bank would be ready for business on August 1st, 1914, but they actually began operations on November 16th, 1914. At that time, their total assets were listed at $143 billion from the sale of shares in the Federal Reserve Banks to stockholders of the national banks which subscribed to it. $143 million. The actual part of this $143 million, which was paid in for these shares, remains. The actual part of this $143 million, which was paid in for these shares, remains shrouded in mystery. Some historians believe that the shareholders only paid about half of the amount in cash. Others believe that they paid in no cash at all, but merely sent in checks which they drew on the national banks which they owned. This seems most likely that from the very outset, the Federal Reserve operations was paper issued against paper, that bookkeeping entries comprised the only values which changed hands. Hello, it's called RICO, it's called gangsta, it's called what they did. The men whom presented Woodrow Wilson chose to make up the first Federal Reserve Board of Governors were men drawn from the banking group. He had been nominated for the presidency. by the Democratic Party, which had claimed to represent the common man against the vested interests. According to Wilson himself, he was allowed to choose only one man for the Federal Reserve Board. The others were chosen by the New York bankers. Wilson's choice was Thomas D. Jones, a trustee of Princeton and director of International Harvester and other corporations. The other members were Adolph C. Miller, economist from Rockefeller's University of Chicago and Morgan's Harvard University, and also serving as Assistant Secretary of the Interior. Charles S. Hamlin, who had served previously as an Assistant Secretary to the Treasury for 8 years, F. A. Delano, a Roosevelt relative and railroad operator who took over a number of railroads for Kuhn Loeb Company, W. P. G. Harding, president of the First National Bank of Atlanta, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company. According to the intimate papers of Colonel House, Warburg was appointed because the president accepted House's suggestion of Paul Warburg of New York because of his interest and experience in currency problems under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Like Warburg, Delano had also been born outside the continental limits of the United States, although he was an American citizen. Delano's father, Warren Delano, according to Dr. Josephson and other authorities, was active in Hong Kong in the Chinese opium trade, and Frederick Delano was born in Hong Kong in 1863. Yeah, his partner in crime was Vidal Sassoon, the Sassoon dynasty. In The Money Power of Europe, Paul Emden writes that the Warburgs reached their outstanding eminence during the last 20 years of the past century, simultaneously with the growth of Kuhn Loeb Company in New York, with whom they stood in a personal union and family relationship. Paul Warburg, with magnificent success, carried through in 1913 the reorganization of the American banking system, at which he had, with Senator Aldrich, been working since 1911, and thus most thoroughly consolidated the currency and finances of the United States. The New York Times had noted on May 6, 1914, that Paul Warburg had retired from Kuhn Loeb Company in order to serve on the Federal Reserve Board, although he had not resigned his dictatorships of American Surety Company, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, National Railways of Mexico, Wells Fargo, or Westinghouse Electric Corporation, but would continue to serve on these boards of directors. See, those are all the things that they get money from us for. That's what they claim. Those are utilities for us that they take our money for. Long story, but anyways. But would continue to serve on these boards of directors. Who's Who listed him as holding these directorships, and in addition, American IG Chemical Company, branch of IG Farben, Agfa Ansco Corporation, Westinghouse Acceptance Company, Warburg Company of Amsterdam, chairman of the board of International Acceptance Bank, and numerous other banks, railways, and corporations. Kuhn-Loeb and Company with Warburg have 4 votes, or the majority of the Federal Reserve Board. Despite his retirement from Kuhn-Loeb Company in May of 1914 to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Warburg was asked to appear before a Senate subcommittee in June of 1914 and answer some questions about his behind-the-scenes role in getting the Federal Reserve Act through Congress. This might have meant some questions about the secret conference in Jekyll Island, and Warburg refused to appear. On July 7, 1914, he wrote a letter to G.M. Hitchcock, chairman of the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, stating that it might impair his usefulness on the board if he were required to answer any questions, and that he would therefore withdraw his name. It seemed that Warburg was prepared to bluff the Senate committee into confirming him without any questions asked. Does that sound familiar to everything we've ever seen in any kind of Senate or Congress committee or anything? It's all poo-poo-nanny. It's all bullshit. And like, who the hell are these people to be like, oh, I fucked up, but I don't want to come talk about it. I gotta do what I want. On July 10, 1914, the New York Times defended Warburg on the editorial page and denounced the senatorial inquisition. Since Warburg had not, guys, that sounds so familiar, Inquisition, yeah, you should understand what the Inquisition actually was. And it was the same people who would say, oh, they're after me, as an Inquisition, a senatorial Inquisition. Since Warburg had not been asked any questions, the term Inquisition seemed remarkably inappropriate, nor was there any real danger that the senators were preparing to use instruments of torture on Mr. Warburg. Exactly, see? They scream at you in pain while they smack you in the face. The imbroglio was resolved when the Senate committee, in abject surrender, agreed that Mr. Warburg would be given a list of questions in advance of his appearance, so that he could go over them and that he could be excused from answering any questions which might tend to impair his service on the Board of Governors. Again, sound familiar? Every interview we ever see on TV, period. The Nation reported on July 23, 1914, that Mr. Warburg finally had a conference with Senator O'Gorman and agreed to meet the members of the Senate subcommittee informally, with a view to coming to an understanding and to giving them any reasonable information they might desire. The opinion in Washington is that Mr. Warburg's confirmation is assured. The Nation was correct. Mr. Warburg was confirmed, the way having been smoothed by his fixer, Senator O'Gorman of New York, more formally known as the Senator from Wall Street. Senator Robert L. Owen had previously charged that Warburg was an American representative of the Rothschild family, but questioning him about this would indeed have smacked of the medieval Inquisition, and his fellow senators were too civilized to indulge in such barbarity. Like, does this not sound familiar over and over and over and over and over again? What other family can we not ask questions about today, or anybody, like, come on. It's ridiculous. And then they try to pretend, what? They try to pretend that this would indeed have smacked of medieval Inquisition. You know what that smacks of to me? Modern day conspiracy theories. This is a medieval Inquisition. That's a conspiracy theory. Same shit, different day, guys. During the Senate hearings on Paul Warburg before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, August 1st, 1914, Senator Bristow asked, how many of these partners of Kuhn-Loeb Company are American citizens? Warburg. They are all American citizens except Mr. Kahn. He is a British subject. Bristow. He was at one time a candidate for Parliament, was he not? Warburg. There was talk about it. It had been suggested, and he had it in his mind. Paul Warburg also stated to the committee, I went to England, where I stayed for 2 years, first in the banking and discount firm of Samuel Montague and Company. After that, I went to France, where I stayed in a French bank. Chairman. What French bank was that? Warburg. It is the Russian Bank for Foreign Trade, which has an agency in Paris. Bristow. I understand you say that you are a Republican? But when Mr. Theodore Roosevelt came around, you then became a sympathizer with Mr. Wilson and supported him? Warburg. Yes. Bristow. While your brother Felix Warburg was supporting Taft? Warburg. Yes. Thus, 3 partners of Cohn-Loeb Company were supporting 3 different candidates for President of the United States. Paul Warburg was supporting Wilson, Felix Warburg was supporting Taft, and Otto Kahn was supporting Theodore Roosevelt. Paul Warburg explained this curious situation by telling the committee that they had no influence over each other's political beliefs. Dude! As finance and politics don't mix. Guys. Questions about Warburg's appointment vanished in a hue and cry with Wilson's sole appointment of the Board of Governors. Thomas B. Jones. Questions about Warburg's appointment vanished in a hue and cry with Wilson's sole appointment to the Board of Governors. Thomas B. Jones. Reporters had discovered that Jones, at the time of his appointment, was under indictment by the Attorney General of the United States. Wilson leaped to the defense of his choice, telling reporters that the majority of the men connected with what we have come to call big business are honest, incorruptible, and patriotic. Despite Wilson's protestations, the Senate Banking and Currency Committee scheduled hearings on the fitness of Thomas V. Jones to be a member of the Board of Governors. Wilson then wrote a letter to Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of that committee. White House. Dear Senator Owen, Mr. Jones has always stood for the rights of the people against the rights of privilege. Dude, get out of here. They always talk all this bullshit, dude. Out. His connection with the Harvester Company was a public service, not a private interest. He is the one man of the whole number who was, in a peculiar sense, my personal choice. Sincerely, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said, there is no reason to believe that the unfavorable report represents the attitude of the Senate itself. After several weeks, Thomas B. Jones withdrew his name, and the country had to do without his services. The other members of the first Board of Governors were Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, Wilson's son-in-law, and President of the Hudson Manhattan Railroad, a Cohn-Loeb Company-controlled enterprise, and Comptroller of the Currency, John Skelton Williams. When the Federal Reserve banks were opened for business on November 16, 1914, Paul Warburg said, this date may be considered as the 4th of July in the economic history of the United States. Gross.